August 9th, 1898, Dover, Delaware. The late afternoon air hung heavy and still across the town, the kind of oppressive heat that made porch sitting a necessity rather than a leisure activity. At 210 South State Street, in the elegant residence of former Congressman John Brown Pennington, the family gathered outside as daylight softened into evening. The temperature had touched 87 degrees earlier that day, and though the sun was beginning its descent, the humidity clung to skin like wet cloth. Inside the house, the darkness promised no relief, only the trapped staleness of rooms sealed against the day's furnace heat. So they sat on the veranda, as decent people did in that time, waiting for the promise of a breeze that never came. None of them knew that death had already arrived, wrapped in pink satin ribbon, addressed in elegant feminine script, and waiting inside the mail box. None of them suspected that someone 3,000 miles away had designed this exact moment with meticulous calculation. And none of them could have imagined that the United States Postal Service had just become, for the first time in American history, an instrument of murder. Mary Elizabeth Pennington Dunning opened the package with no more concern than one might feel about opening a letter from an old friend. She was 35 years old, the daughter of a respected politician, educated and kind-hearted, known throughout Dover as a woman of exceptional sweetness and moral character. She had married John Preston Dunning in February of 1891, believing she was joining her life to a man of ambition and talent. He was, after all, a celebrated foreign correspondent for the Associated Press, a man who had covered cyclones in Samoa, civil wars in Chile, and would soon witness Teddy Roosevelt charging up San Juan Hill. But what newspapers failed to report was that John Dunning was also a chronic gambler, a severe alcoholic, and a man who collected affairs with women the way other men collected stamps. By 1896, Mary had endured enough. She took their daughter and returned to Delaware, to her father's house, to the safety of a place where honor still meant something. She never divorced him. She never stopped writing him daily letters. She held on to a version of him that existed only in her imagination, a version that might one day come back to her redeemed. The package bore a San Francisco postmark. Inside the brown paper wrapping was a white box decorated with gold script that read bonbons. The box itself was tied with pink ribbon, a feminine touch that suggested thoughtfulness. Inside, nestled against white tissue paper, were rows of chocolate creams, oblong bonbons, and chocolate drops covered in sugary sprinkles. A handkerchief was folded beneath them, still bearing its store tag from City of Paris, a fashionable San Francisco department store. Tucked alongside the confections was a small slip of paper. The note read, "With love to yourself and baby, Mrs. C." Mary studied the handwriting. She did not recognize it, but she was a woman beloved in her community, surrounded by friends, charitable and gracious to all. She had no reason to suspect malice, so she did what any gracious woman would do. She shared the candy. Her sister, Ida Hanby Dean, 44 years old, and the mother of 2 young children, took several pieces. Ida's children, Joshua Jr. and Elizabeth, each ate a piece. 2 neighborhood girls, Miss Millington and Miss Bateman, stopped by while passing on the street and were offered candy. They accepted politely, as young ladies did in that era, and ate theirs before continuing their walk home. Mary herself ate 3 pieces. The chocolate melted sweetly on the tongue. There was no bitterness, no warning. Arsenic, when properly disguised, is tasteless and odorless. Within 4 hours, every person who had eaten the candy was writhing in agony. The vomiting began first. Then came the cramping, violent spasms that twisted intestines and sent bodies convulsing. Dr. S. L. Heisel was summoned. He recognized the symptoms immediately, but could do nothing to reverse what had already been set in motion. Mary Elizabeth Dunning died on August 12th, 3 days after opening the box. Her sister Ida died 1 day earlier, on August 11th. The others survived, their youth and the smaller doses they consumed, sparing them the same fate. The autopsies confirmed what Dr. Heisel suspected: massive arsenic poisoning. Dr. T. R. Wolfe, the state chemist from Delaware College, analyzed the remaining chocolates. What he found staggered him. Each piece of candy contained enough arsenic to kill an adult. One chunk of the poison embedded in a single bonbon was, in his words, as large as a pea. The 3 pieces examined contained enough arsenic to kill 4 people. This was not the work of someone hoping poison might take effect. This was the work of someone who wanted certainty, someone who wanted death to be agonizing, unmistakable, and absolute. John Pennington, the grieving father, examined the box and the note carefully. Something about the handwriting nagged at him. He went to his desk and retrieved a folder of letters he had saved over the past year, anonymous letters that had been sent to his daughter from San Francisco. The letters were poison themselves, filled with sordid details of John Dunning's affairs, specifically mentioning an interesting and pretty English woman he was constantly seen with. Pennington laid the note from the candy box beside one of the anonymous letters. The handwriting was identical. Whoever had been tormenting his daughter with written cruelty had now escalated to murder. John Preston Dunning was in Puerto Rico when the telegram reached him. He was covering the Spanish-American War for the Associated Press, filing dispatches about American soldiers and tropical diseases and the chaos of combat. The telegram was brief. Wife and sister-in-law dead. Poisoning suspected. Return immediately. He boarded the next ship back to the mainland, and when he arrived at the port in New York, reporters swarmed him like flies on carrion. War correspondents were celebrities in that era, and this was a scandal too delicious to ignore. A journalist himself, Dunning understood what they wanted. They wanted a quote. They wanted emotion. They wanted a headline. He gave them all 3. When asked who could have poisoned his wife, he stopped on the gangplank, turned, and said the name out loud for the first time: Cordilia Botkin. He knew her handwriting as intimately as he knew his own. He had received dozens of letters from her during their 3-year affair, letters drenched in longing and possessiveness. He remembered, with sudden and sickening clarity, the conversations they had shared. He had told Cordelia that his wife was passionately fond of candy. He had mentioned casually that Mary had a dear friend in San Francisco, a woman named Mrs. Corbally, whose first initial was C. Those details, meaningless at the time, now formed a blueprint for murder. Cordelia had used his own words to engineer his wife's death. She had even signed the note with the initial C, knowing that Mary would assume the candy came from a friend, that she would open it without hesitation, that she would eat it and share it and die without ever suspecting that her husband's mistress had reached across 3,000 miles to destroy her. Cordelia Botkin did not live in the shadows. She was not a woman who hid her appetites or her presence. Born Cordelia Brown in 1854, she had been raised in Brownsville, Nebraska, a town named after her own father. She married Welcome A. Botkin on September 26, 1872 in Kansas City, and bore him a son named Beverly. For over 2 decades, the marriage existed in name only. Welcome Botkin moved to Stockton, California, and lived with their grown son, while Cordelia remained in San Francisco, maintaining her own residence and living her own life. It was an arrangement that suited them both. Cordelia loved attention. She loved luxury. She loved being photographed. And by her own admission, she had posed for more than 100 portraits, each one carefully staged to display her vanity. Newspapers later remarked on this excess, printing multiple photos of her in different poses, noting her excessive fondness for posing and the vanities of womankind, which she possesses in an exaggerated degree. In 1895, John Dunning's bicycle broke down during a ride through Golden Gate Park. Some later accounts suggested he engineered the breakdown deliberately. Regardless of intent, he noticed Cordelia Botkin sitting on a nearby bench and struck up a conversation. She told him her name was Curtis and that her husband was in England. The lie came easily. Dunning, who was never one to pass up an opportunity, secured a date before he finished repairing his bicycle. That was the beginning. They met again and again. Eventually, Cordelia admitted the truth. She was married to Welcome Botkin, but they lived separately, and she had a grown son. Dunning did not care. He had a wife and a daughter living at 2529 California Street, but that did not stop him from moving into the same boarding house where Cordelia lived, at 927 Geary Street. They became lovers. They were seen together constantly, at racetracks and cafes, making no effort to conceal their relationship. Dunning called her Ada, a reference, he said, to a former love she resembled. It was a cruelty he seemed to enjoy, reducing her to an echo of someone else even as she devoted herself to him entirely. Mary Dunning, upon learning of the affair, left San Francisco in 1896 and returned to her father's house in Dover with their daughter. She did not file for divorce. She continued to write to her husband every single day, letters filled with mundane details and affection, as if distance and decency might be enough to bring him back. Dunning, for his part, wrote back. He told her everything about his life, his work, his surroundings, his thoughts. Everything except the one thing that mattered most: Cordelia Botkin. While Mary wrote letters hoping for reconciliation, Cordelia wrote letters designed to destroy that hope. The anonymous messages sent to Dover were her work, thinly veiled reports of Dunning's infidelities meant to ensure that Mary would never come back, that the marriage would dissolve entirely, and that Dunning would belong to her alone. But obsession is a poor foundation for loyalty. In March of 1898, Dunning accepted a position as a war correspondent to cover the Spanish-American War in Puerto Rico. It was the opportunity of a lifetime, a chance to rebuild his crumbling reputation after he had been fired from the Associated Press for embezzling over $4,000 to cover his gambling debts. When he told Cordelia he was leaving, she begged him to stay. He refused. Then she asked when he would return to San Francisco. He told her the truth. He would not be coming back. After the war, he was going to Delaware to reconcile with his wife and daughter. Cordelia accompanied him to the train station in Oakland. They said their goodbyes on the platform. She wept openly. He boarded the train and never looked back. That was the moment Cordelia Botkin decided that if she could not have him, Mary Dunning would not have him either. The decision to use poison was deliberate. Poison has always been considered a woman's weapon, quiet and indirect, requiring patience rather than physical strength. Arsenic was widely available in the late 19th century, sold in drugstores for purposes ranging from taxidermy to pest control to bleaching straw hats. It was cheap, it was effective, and it was nearly impossible to detect until after death. What set Cordelia apart was not her choice of weapon, but her method of delivery. She understood that she could not travel to Delaware herself. She understood that any direct contact would make her an obvious suspect. So she designed a crime that would span the entire country, using the United States Postal Service as her accomplice. No one had ever done this before. The Botkin-Dunning case would become the first documented instance of murder by mail in American legal history, and it would force courts to confront a legal question they had never before considered. Where does a crime occur when the act and the consequence are separated by 3,000 miles? Cordelia began her preparations in late July of 1898. On July 27th, she visited a friend in Stockton named Almura Ruoff and engaged her in a strange conversation. She asked detailed questions about the effects of different poisons on the human body. She asked whether it was necessary to sign one's name when sending a registered package through the mail. Mrs. Ruff found the questions odd, but thought little of it at the time. 4 days later, on July 31st, Cordelia walked into the candy store owned by George Haas, located under the Phelan Building on Market Street in San Francisco. Two clerks, Miss Sylvia Heaney and Miss Kitty Dittmer, both remembered her clearly. She was particular about what she wanted. She selected chocolates and requested that they be placed in a fancy white box that did not have the store's name printed on it. She specified that the box should not be filled completely because, she explained, she had another article to place inside. The clerks complied. They tied the box with pink satin ribbon and handed it to her. Later, when shown photographs during the trial, both women positively identified Cordelia as the customer who made that purchase. The next step required arsenic. Cordelia visited the Owl Drug Store on Market Street. Behind the counter was a clerk named Frank Gray. She told him she needed arsenic to bleach a straw hat. Mr. Gray, who knew his business, informed her that there were far better products for that purpose, products that would not require her to sign the poison register. Cordelia refused his suggestions. She insisted on arsenic. She wanted 2 ounces. Mr. Gray sold it to her, and she signed the register with a false name, Mrs. Botkin. The misspelling was intentional, a thin disguise that would later prove meaningless. Mr. Gray remembered her face. He remembered her insistence. He would later testify that he had never seen a woman so determined to obtain a substance she claimed not to need for the reason she stated. On August 4th, Cordelia completed her task. She opened the candy box, laced each piece with arsenic, and resealed it. She placed the handkerchief inside, still bearing its City of Paris store tag, never realizing this single detail would become damning evidence. She wrote the note, "With love to yourself and baby, Mrs. C." She wrapped the box in brown paper and addressed it in her own handwriting to Mrs. John P. Dunning, Dover, Delaware. Then she took it to the ferry post office in San Francisco and mailed it. A postal clerk named John Dunnigan specifically remembered processing the package because the name on the address, Mrs. John Dunning, reminded him of his own surname. After mailing it, Cordelia left San Francisco and traveled to St. Helena, a small town in Napa County. She was there, staying quietly out of sight, when the package arrived in Dover 5 days later. She was there when Mary and Ida ate the candy. She was there when they died, and she made no effort to flee. When San Francisco police, acting on a telegram from Delaware authorities, arrived to arrest her on August 26th, they found her at her husband's home in Stockton, calmly preparing to change her clothes for the 2nd or 3rd time that day. The arrest was theatrical. When presented with the warrant, Cordelia sank onto the sofa and moaned, "The chagrin is past. The horror is over. I have suffered all the humiliation. I am ready." She asked for permission to pack a trunk of clothing for her jail stay, and the police allowed it. The trunk she packed was so heavy with gowns and accessories that it required 2 deputies to carry it out of the house. She was escorted to the police station on the arm of Chief Isaiah W. Lees himself, and the next morning, every newspaper in San Francisco sold out before noon. The public was ravenous for details. A murder spanning 2 coasts, a love triangle involving a war correspondent, poisoned chocolates, anonymous letters, a vengeful mistress. It had everything a scandal required. But the case against Cordelia Botkin was not as simple as public opinion assumed. Jurisdiction became the first battleground. Delaware authorities wanted to try her in Dover, where the murders had occurred. Cordelia's attorney, George Knight, argued that because she had never set foot in Delaware, she could not be prosecuted there. The poison had been placed in the mail in California, he argued, and therefore California was the only state with legal authority to try her. On October 23, 1898, 5 Superior Court judges sitting en banc rendered their decision. The trial would be held in San Francisco. The reasoning was novel. Cordelia's flight from Delaware, the court concluded, was not actual but constructive. She had caused harm in Delaware without ever physically entering the state, and that harm constituted a crime subject to California's jurisdiction. The California Supreme Court upheld the decision. It was a landmark ruling, the first time American courts addressed the question of interstate crime committed through the postal system. The precedent it established would shape criminal law for decades. On October 28, 1898, a grand jury indicted Cordelia Botkin for the murder of Mary Elizabeth Dunning. The trial began on December 9th, and from the first day, it was a spectacle. More than 500 people were turned away from the courtroom during closing arguments. The gallery packed beyond capacity with spectators desperate to witness the proceedings. The San Francisco Examiner set up a bulletin board outside the courthouse where reporters posted live updates throughout the day. Cordelia arrived each morning impeccably dressed, her vanity on full display even as she faced a potential death sentence. The newspapers remarked on her demeanor, noting that she smiled as she talked, and occasionally showed the handsome teeth of which she is extremely proud. The prosecution built its case piece by piece, each fragment of evidence forming a mosaic of guilt. Handwriting expert Theodore Kitka testified that the writing on the candy box and the note inside matched the handwriting in love letters Cordelia had sent to John Dunning. Kitka's testimony was meticulous, comparing the loops and slants and pressure of pen strokes, demonstrating for the jury that the same hand had written both the passionate declarations of love and the deadly note signed Mrs. C. Druggist Frank Gray took the stand and identified Cordelia as the woman who purchased arsenic under a false name, insisting on a substance she claimed to need for bleaching a straw hat. The candy store clerks, Miss Heaney and Miss Dittmer, testified that Cordelia had purchased chocolates from George Haas's shop and requested a box without the store's name, specifying that it should not be filled completely because she intended to add something else. Mrs. Grace Harris, a clerk at the City of Paris department store, testified that she had sold Cordelia the handkerchief found in the candy box. She remembered the transaction vividly, she explained, because Cordelia bore a striking resemblance to her late mother. She even produced a photograph of her mother to show the jury the uncanny likeness. Then there was the matter of the gilded seal. After Cordelia vacated her room at the Hotel Victoria, located at Hyde and California streets, hotel staff found a torn piece of a gilded seal on the floor of room 26. The seal matched those used by George Haas's candy store. Examination of the wrapping on the candy box sent to Mary Dunning showed clearly where a seal had been removed. Cordelia had opened the box, poisoned the contents, and attempted to reseal it. But the missing seal betrayed her. Postal clerk John Dunnigan testified that he had processed a package addressed to Mrs. John Dunning at the Ferry Post Office on August 4th, and that he remembered it specifically because the name reminded him of his own. The timeline was airtight. Cordelia had purchased the candy on July 31st. She had purchased the arsenic shortly thereafter. She had mailed the package on August 4th. And on August 9th, exactly 5 days later, it arrived in Dover. The defense had little to work with. Cordelia's attorney attempted to suggest that someone else, someone who resembled her, might have made the purchases. But the witnesses were unshakable. He argued that the evidence was circumstantial, that no one had seen Cordelia actually poison the chocolates, but circumstantial evidence, when overwhelming, in volume and consistency, becomes as damning as direct observation. On December 19th, John Dunning himself took the stand. He confirmed that the handwriting belonged to Cordelia. He confirmed that he had told her about his wife's fondness for candy. He confirmed their affair. Then the prosecutor asked him to name the other women he had been intimate with during his marriage. Dunning refused. The judge held him in contempt of court and sent him to jail, where he remained for several days until the question was withdrawn. It was a strange moment of integrity from a man whose infidelity had precipitated 2 deaths. On December 30th, 1898, the jury deliberated for 4 hours and returned a verdict: guilty of first-degree murder. On February 4th, 1899, Cordelia Botkin was sentenced to life imprisonment. She showed no emotion. She maintained her innocence, insisting that someone must have framed her, that the real killer had cleverly used her identity to commit the crime. No one believed her. But before she could be transferred to San Quentin State Prison, a legal technicality intervened. The California Supreme Court had recently ruled in an unrelated case, People v. Hoff, that trial judges erred when instructing juries that circumstantial evidence has the advantage over direct evidence because it is not likely to be fabricated. The court held that such language constituted an improper expression of the judge's opinion on the weight of evidence. Because the same instruction had been given in Cordelia's trial, her conviction was overturned, and a new trial was ordered. Delaware authorities had to bring their witnesses back to San Francisco. The second trial began in 1904 and followed the same script as the first. The evidence was identical. The testimony was identical. The verdict, delivered on August 2, 1904, was identical: guilty. Cordelia Botkin was again sentenced to life imprisonment. This time, the conviction was upheld. On October 29, 1908, the California Supreme Court affirmed the judgment, and Cordelia was finally transferred to San Quentin State Prison to serve her sentence. But her years of incarceration between the 2 trials had been anything but harsh. While held in the Branch County Jail awaiting the outcome of her appeal, Cordelia enjoyed privileges that shocked even the trial judge who had sentenced her. On a Sunday afternoon in April of 1900, Superior Court Judge Carroll Cook was riding a streetcar to visit his wife's grave. He glanced out the window and saw a woman he immediately recognized: Cordelia Botkin. She was unguarded, riding the same streetcar, dressed as if enjoying a casual day out. When the car reached the county jail, she signaled for it to stop, stepped off, and walked toward the building. Judge Cook was astonished. The next day, he launched an investigation. Jail officials denied that Cordelia had ever left the building. They produced affidavits swearing she had been in her cell all day. But the rumors were persistent. It was widely believed that Cordelia had been granted extraordinary liberties in exchange for sexual favors provided to guards and officers. The 1947 book San Francisco Murders referred to unspecified favors she had allegedly showered on her jailers. Her cell, by all accounts, was comfortable, furnished with luxuries, and she received frequent visitors. She continued to pose for photographs, her vanity undiminished by incarceration. When the 1906 earthquake destroyed much of San Francisco, the main jail was damaged, and the branch jail where Cordelia was held became overcrowded. She lost the comfortable quarters she had enjoyed for years. In May of 1906, even though the Supreme Court had not yet ruled on her second conviction, Cordelia petitioned to be transferred to San Quentin State Prison. Her request was granted. Prison was less forgiving than the county jail. The privileges disappeared. The isolation set in. One by one, the people connected to her life began to die. Her mother died. Her sister died. Her son died. Her former husband, Welcome A. Botkin, who had divorced her on March 9, 1899, citing her felony conviction, also died. And on April 17, 1907, John Dunning died in a Philadelphia hospital. He was 44 years old, destitute and ravaged by alcoholism and a brain tumor. He had never rebuilt his career. He had never recovered from the scandal. His only daughter, raised by relatives after her mother's murder, attended his funeral. Cordelia, upon hearing the news, stopped eating. She fell into a deep depression. Prison physicians noted her declining health and diagnosed her with nervous prostration. She became a physical wreck. Her vanity eroded, her spirit broken. In late 1909, she began to suffer from what doctors called melancholia. In February of 1910, she applied for parole on the grounds of failing health. The parole board reviewed her case and determined that she was not eligible. On March 7, 1910, Cordelia Botkin lost consciousness in her cell. She never woke up. She was 56 years old. The official death certificate listed the cause of death as softening of the brain due to melancholy. She was buried alone in Oak Mound Cemetery in Healdsburg, California. Her gravestone a solitary marker bearing only her name and the years of her life. She never confessed. She never expressed remorse. To the end, she maintained that she had been wrongly convicted, that someone else must have used her identity to commit the crime. But the evidence spoke louder than her denials. The handwriting, the witnesses, the arsenic, the candy, the handkerchief, the timeline. Every piece fit together with the precision of a machine designed for one purpose: murder. The pink satin ribbon became the recurring symbol of the case, appearing in newspaper illustrations and courtroom exhibits, a delicate and feminine object that had adorned a box containing death. It was the kind of ribbon a woman might tie around a gift for a dear friend, a gesture of affection and thoughtfulness. Cordelia had counted on that. She had counted on Mary opening the box without suspicion. She had counted on the candy being shared, on the poison spreading through the household, on John Dunning receiving the news and knowing immediately that his infidelity had killed his wife. The ribbon was not merely decorative, it was psychological warfare, a final cruelty wrapped in the appearance of kindness. The case transformed American jurisprudence in ways that extended far beyond Cordelia Botkin's guilt. For the first time, courts were forced to address the question of how to prosecute a crime when the criminal act and its consequences occurred in different states. The ruling that California had jurisdiction set a precedent that would be cited in countless cases involving interstate crime, from mail fraud to terrorism. It established that the law could follow a criminal's intent across state lines, that geographic distance did not create immunity, and that the United States Postal Service, an instrument of commerce and communication, could also be an instrument of accountability. The case also highlighted the limitations of forensic science in the late 19th century. Arsenic was detectable in tissue samples after death, but there was no reliable method for testing food for poison before it was consumed. Handwriting analysis, still a relatively new field, was emerging as a powerful tool in criminal investigations, and Cordelia's case demonstrated its effectiveness. The testimony of Theodore Kitka helped establish handwriting comparison as admissible and persuasive evidence in American courts. For the people of Dover, Delaware, the murders reshaped the community's sense of safety. Dover was a small town, a place where everyone knew everyone, where former congressmen lived next door to shopkeepers, where children walked freely down streets and neighbors shared food without hesitation. The idea that death could arrive in the mail, disguised as a gift, wrapped in ribbon, sent from someone thousands of miles away, was incomprehensible. It violated every assumption about how danger presented itself. Mary Elizabeth Dunning was not killed by a stranger lurking in an alley. She was killed by a woman she had never met, in a crime orchestrated with patience and precision, using a weapon that required no physical confrontation. The randomness of it, the helplessness of it, haunted Dover for generations. The house where the murders occurred, at 210 South State Street, remained standing for over a century, a quiet reminder of the tragedy that unfolded on its veranda. For John Dunning, the guilt was inescapable. He had pursued his own pleasure without regard for consequence, and when consequence arrived, it came in the form of 2 coffins. He had told Cordelia about his wife's love of candy. He had mentioned Mrs. Corbailey's name. He had given her the tools to commit murder, not knowing he was doing so, but understanding too late that his carelessness had made him complicit. He tried to rebuild his life after the trial, but the scandal followed him everywhere. He drank more heavily. He gambled away what little money he earned. He died alone in a hospital, unmourned except by the daughter he had failed to protect. His career, once so promising, ended in obscurity. His name, once associated with adventure and courage, became synonymous with betrayal and tragedy. The transformation the case imposed on the concept of murder itself was perhaps its most enduring legacy. Prior to Cordelia Botkin, murder was understood as a crime of proximity. The killer and the victim occupied the same space, if only for a moment. Poison changed that, allowing for delayed death. But even poison required the killer to be in the same room, the same house, the same town. Cordelia demonstrated that murder could be committed from a distance of 3,000 miles, that it could be planned in one state and executed in another, that the postal system could carry death as efficiently as it carried letters and packages. The phrase "murder by mail" entered the American lexicon. Cordelia Botkin was not the last person to use the Postal Service to kill, but she was the first, and her case forced lawmakers, judges, and law enforcement to confront a new reality. That distance no longer protected victims. That intent could travel faster than any person, and that the law would need to adapt to keep pace with criminal ingenuity. In the end, what Cordelia Botkin left behind was not love or passion or even infamy, though she achieved all 3 in varying degrees. What she left was a question that still resonates more than a century later. How far will obsession drive a person, and how much damage can a single human being inflict when love curdles into possession and possession curdles into rage? She destroyed 2 lives with her own hands. She destroyed more through the cascade of grief that followed. She shattered a family, ruined a man, and forced an entire nation to reckon with the idea that evil does not always announce itself with violence and blood. Sometimes it arrives wrapped in ribbon, smelling of chocolate, signed with an initial that means nothing and everything. Sometimes it knocks politely at the door and waits to be invited in, And by the time you realize what you have welcomed into your home, it is already too late. The candy box is gone now. The chocolates were destroyed as evidence. The ribbon was discarded. The handkerchief with its damning store tag was lost to time. But the story remains, preserved in court transcripts and newspaper archives, a reminder that the cruelest crimes are often the ones disguised as gifts, and that the deadliest weapons are not always the ones we see coming. If this story disturbed you, haunted you, or made you question how well you really know the people around you, subscribe and click the bell icon so you never miss the next case.